Hey, my name is Ante Jeroncic, and this is Artis Vivendi, the craft of living. Welcome to another episode. I'm again very happy and excited to be able to share one particular thinker who has influenced me, not just me, but a generation of thinkers in the 20th century and 21st century. His name is Hans-Georg Gadamer, and you might not be familiar with him. He is not a household name to most people, but he has influenced 20th century thought in a very significant way. And I think he's very pertinent because he's dealing with such key questions and key issues, such as like what is interpretation and the function of language and what is the meaning of understanding and dialogue, something that is so deeply important for our current cultural context. I'll be talking about this in a while, and I hope that you will listen to this and find something that is meaningful and significant for your life. But as a part of this introduction, let me just share something that I have really been thinking about quite a bit the last couple of weeks. Namely, it pertains to a book that I've read and just finished the other day. It is a book by James K.A. Smith titled On the Road with St. Augustine. I had that book for a while and I kind of hesitated reading it. I don't know for what reason. I use James K. Smith quite a bit in my classes. His book, for instance, You Are What You Love, is a book that people enjoy tremendously. You do not need to be a specialist in theology, religion, and philosophy to be able to really find it quite impactful, as many people have. So this could be a reason. I have my fair share of Smith in the last couple of years. I'm not sure I want to read something more. So that was my thought, and then I picked it up. And something very, very strange happened, and it is not easy for me to convey what I have in mind. I've read, in the last 10 or 20 years, a number of books, and these books, you find them good, moving, interesting, they impact you, they have good ideas, they're creative, all kinds of reasons that you could name as to why a book might be impactful in your life. But this book did something very unusual. And the best way to describe it is to say that it really touched some deep registers of my soul. It plucked on some strings deep within me. And I don't know how else to describe it. I would read it and I felt as if it touched some either sore points or some significant questions or some issues I've been dealing with, not intellectually primarily, but spiritually and existentially. And I will not exaggerate, it brought me to tears. And I usually don't cry when I read books that move me, but this was almost like a cathartic experience, talking about themes such as homecoming and homelessness and exile, the question of being on a road and a journey without destinations, without fixed destinations, which is really a good way to describe the condition of modernity when many of us and many people are experiencing homelessness of all different kinds, right? So that spoke to me in a different way, in a deep way, because this is a topic that I've been thinking about on and off now for an extended period of time. Let me repeat it again. Primarily because my whole life has been a quest for homecoming as an immigrant kid who grew up in Germany and then came back home, which wasn't really home, and then South Africa, America, never really being at home in my kind of skin, in my language that I'm using. I mean, these kind of different experiences of homelessness. That's why it touched me deeply. A very moving reflection on fathers and this proverbial search for our fathers who might have been absent or present, but then absent in their spirit, or perhaps fathers with whom we could never really connect. Deeply moving chapter on friendship, on suffering, on death. And each of these chapters really moved me quite significantly. And I'm still reeling from reading that book. And I imagine that in future episodes, references to Smith are going to pop up from time to time for sure. I just have to share this because it was uncanny. It was uncanny how moved I was by reading a book from which I did not expect that kind of an outcome. So I thought of just relaying this to you and sharing this with you, and hopefully, if you have time, if you have any inclinations, just pick up the book. There's a little bit of philosophy, but nothing that a reader, non-specialist reader could not really pick up and understand easily. Again, it's just a highly recommended book. So let us now move to our episode on Hans-Georg Gadamer. So Hans-Georg Gadamer is this interesting figure who was born in 1900 and died in 2002. So spanning the whole of the 20th century. And during the time, he wrote a number of important books, his Truth and Method perhaps being his most important and well-known one, in which he discusses some important issues, which I will try to convey in a accessible way, I hope, right? And in a way that really reflects, again, the stated purpose of this channel. In any case, so some time ago, I listened to a lecture that he gave in 1990. So he was exactly 90 years old. And I was in awe looking at this elderly gentleman and the way in which he was fully possessive of his intellectual and rhetorical faculties, just presenting almost extemporaneously in a very clear, lucid, passionate way. And in that lecture, he begins with a favorite story of his, actually, and it is found in the Bible. It is the story of the Tower of Babel, where God intervenes and confuses the languages of people who are trying to, build this edifice in order to reach, as the Bible tells us, the heavens. Now, for Gadamer, that is such an important illustration of the human condition, namely the profound inability to really understand each other. When Gadamer looks at the landscape, not just of his time, the 20th century, but the whole of human history, he detects this perennial struggle for human beings to communicate, to dialogue, and really understand each other. So this question of understanding and what is implied in understanding, and who we need to be and what we need to do in order to fully understand others, ourselves, and the world in which we find ourselves, that has been a central preoccupation of Gadamer for many years. So in order to then unpack him a little bit more and how this issue of understanding plays itself out in his thought, I want to just briefly look at three themes. There are many themes that we could look at, but just three themes that are central to his thought. It is the issue of hermeneutics, which simply is another word of for interpretation, like interpretation, that's what it is. Second, it is the problem of language. And then third, I want to talk about the question and the issue of dialogue. So first, then, interpretation. Gadamer makes clear that we can use the word interpretation in two distinct ways. We can use interpretation, as we usually use it, in reference to texts, like legal texts, sacred texts, where we try to understand what a particular, text is saying and try to get to the thing of the text, the meaning of the text. Now, of course, the question of meaning and where the meaning resides, when we are reading something has been a long-standing issue in hermeneutics. Is the meaning in the intention of the author, in the text, or perhaps in front of the text, in the sense that I construct meaning as I read the text. And I would perhaps in some other context and venue argue, yes, I think meaning has to do with all of these three elements, but that is kind of another thing. So that's what one meaning of hermeneutics is, right? The struggle to properly understand written documents. But there's another deeper or broader or more encompassing notion of hermeneutics. And it is sometimes referred to as philosophical hermeneutics, where the emphasis is not so much on interpreting specific texts, but the important realization that we as humans are interpretive beings. We cannot but interpret, and we do so all the time. So one way to refer then to the Homo sapiens is to refer to ourselves, to human beings, as Homo hermeneuticus. We are therefore fundamentally interpretive beings. Interpretation is going all the time. And one of the basic insights of Gadamer and philosophical hermeneutics in general is that we don't have first interpretation and then meaning, right? It is not as if we first see the world and then we give some meaning to our perception. No. Seeing the world, perceiving the world, interpreting the world is already always connected with meaning ascription, ascribing meaning to what we are seeing. Our life situatedness, if I can put it in another way, of life situatedness always makes us perceive the world in a certain way, with a certain tinge, in a certain cast, right? And so it could be my gender, my social sort of location, my historical circumstances, my profession, my aptitudes, my character, all of that. All of these elements, they prime me to see the world in a certain way, never in a completely disinterested way, never completely separated from a framework of meaning which I inhabit and through which I perceive absolutely everything, right? So hermeneutics therefore tells us that knowledge is always interest-driven. Like even in the sciences, right? It is human passions or human creativity or human interests of different kind that always spur us on and that lead us towards comprehension, and comprehension in a very specific way. So that is one of the insights, right? We don't have knowledge and then interpretation. All knowledge, all perception is already interpreted knowledge, and that is a basic insight that Gadamer articulated and which we take for granted in many ways. So that's one aspect of the ubiquity of interpretation. The second aspect concerning this ubiquity issue has to do that we, as I mentioned already, interpret all the time. I interpret this situation as being nerve-wracking in a way, trying to record, trying to articulate my thoughts. But we also interpret as we are looking at menus, when we go to a restaurant, when we see signs on the street, when we try to understand what the other person is saying, telling us, not simply the words that the person is conveying to us, but perhaps the intent or some deeper underlying issues. So interpretation is going on all the time. We do it at every single almost moment of our lives. We always try to orient ourselves. We always try to relate to the reality understandingly, if I can use some language perhaps that Martin Heidegger would put it, right? And just as I mentioned, Martin Heidegger, who very much emphasized this idea of facticity and the way that we are always, our being, our Dasein, our existence is always part of a network of relations, right? I'm not just a human being. I am a certain individual who stands in certain networks of responsibility, certain interests that I have, certain profession, certain relations, and all of that defines my perspective and my outlook. And that is something that Gadamer tries to uncover, develop, let me put it that way rather. And as someone who was a student of Heidegger, it is not surprising that that is the case. So that is one insight that we have in Gadamer, and he tries to approach this problem from many different perspectives. Now, of course, this understanding that, or this, no pun intended, right? This understanding that our understanding is always situated simply speaks to human finitude. It is not a type of relativism, right? It is not a type of relativism to say that we always see things from a certain perspective. If you were to say two things, right? If you were to say that there is no reality, that all reality is completely constructed, there isn't really a thing that I try to understand. Or perhaps if you come to the claim where you say, all interpretations of reality are equally valid. Well, that would put us into some relativistic waters. But if you maintain this notion of finitude on the one hand, right, and on the other hand, you believe that there is some ontological realness, that there is actually a world out there, there is actually a thing in the text that I try to understand, and that not all interpretations are equally valid, well, then I would say that we are more in the waters, not so much of relativism, but a type of what people refer to as critical realism, right? We affirm that we are always limited, always potentially mistaken, always conditioned by our tradition, as Gadamer would put it, and our context, right? That is firm, that is undeniable, right? And then on the other hand, you also affirm, well, yeah, this conditioning is true, but there still is a world out there that I can understand, right? As I mentioned this before, as Roy Barskar refers to this as the ontological intransitivity of reality. There is something real out there. And secondly, not all interpretations are valid, right? If you say that Madame Bovary, for instance, is a man, right? Or that Ivan Karamazov is a German gentleman, I'm just using characters from two famous novels, you actually are quite wrong, right? So we can adjudicate different interpretations, right? And that's very important. I believe that many quote-unquote postmodern thinkers, including Umberto Eco, would recognize that there are limits to interpretation. So I would say then that rather than being a type of relativism, philosophical hermeneutics, as we see it in Gadamer, is a type of critical realism that tries to have these sort of the recognition of the situatedness of human knowledge, while at the same time affirming the possibility to make a judgment among different interpretations. But I believe that if someone, as Christians, like we have a vested interest in actually recognizing that, because not only do we believe in the idea of creaturehood, in the sense that the basic postulate of Christian faith is God is God and we are not God. So God has absolute truth, but I don't have absolute truth, as some of these themes I developed in my previous episode on Nietzsche. And so I don't want to go through this again, but it is this similar emphasis on creaturehood and finitude that we need to stress, with the understanding, with this additional idea that not only are we finite, but we are also fallen, right? I mean, we often think from positions of self-interest and self-deception, and again, that is something that I unpacked in my episode on Nietzsche. So that is one thing that we see in Gadamer, this recognition, right, that we are fundamentally hermeneutical creatures, that interpretation, everything is always about interpretation. That when you try to deal with moral issues, let's say, when you try to discern what is going on, what you need to do, who is involved, what should be your course of action, should you do it now, should you do it alone with others, all these deliberations are deeply enmeshed in kind of interpretive exercises or interpretive realities, right? How we interpret will lead to how we act. And for me, just a side comment, this question of how our character and our way of being in the world determines our interpretation and thereby our access to truth is really something that animates much of my research and my teaching and reflection. So that's Gadamer, right? This idea that we always interpret. The second thing is his recognition about language. As a matter of fact, if you try to read 20th century philosophy, you would do a good job, let me put it that way. You would do a good job by approaching 20th century philosophy through two lenses. The first one would be the hermeneutical turn, and I briefly talked about it already. And the second would be the linguistic turn, where you look at such important thinkers as Wittgenstein and Heidegger. Now, I will not go into all of that, except as to say that Gadamer rightly realizes that language is both a source of revelation and a source of obfuscation. The fact that I'm able to have this episode, the fact that I'm able to say something of Gadamer and that you can have some understanding of what I'm trying to say shows you the power and the potentiality of language. Without language, there is no understanding, there is no communication. So that's very, very important. At the same time, and this is what many postmodern thinkers have stressed, that language is also a source of deep, profound misunderstanding, right? So when I tell you, as I did in the introduction, that I was deeply moved by reading Smith's book, on the one hand, you have an inkling what I try to communicate. Yet at the same time, it is quite impossible for me to describe to you the qualia, the individual felt experience that I had while reading that book. I cannot convey that. And I can never be sure that you fully understood what I tried to convey. Now, this has, of course, a broader implication, namely that a lot of our debates, a lot of our conversations, a lot of our misunderstandings actually are of a semantic nature. Very often, you have seen this very often taking place, right? We talk about the same reality, and yet we use we use the same words, let me put it that way. We use the same words, but we infuse them with different meanings, and that then creates misunderstanding. And a lot of the debates that people are having within the Christian community, outside of the Christian community, when you start parsing the nature of these disagreements, they're very often semantic in nature. And that is one thing that Gadamer really understood, that all our self-understanding, our understanding of the world is always mediated through language. And language has this double element of revelation and obfuscation. So that's the second element then. The first one being hermeneutics, the second one being language, and now the third one, and this is the one that is perhaps even most relevant for what this channel is all about, and it has to do with dialogue. Now, recently I was part of an interview where I discussed the issue of dialogue and the importance of dialogue, and I will provide a link to that recording, but I want to take this up again from a slightly different perspective. And that is the insight, right, that dialogue, that is something that is not just incidental to being human, but is fundamental to who we are. Like, if human existence is always intersubjective, if we always stand in relation, not just even to ourselves, but also to others and to nature, then human existence by its very nature is fundamentally dialogical. Like, dialogical in that sense, in a structural sense. But dialogical also in the sense that there's a moral imperative included in that. Because dialogue implies openness to the other person, to the other people, to the wider world. So when I say that we human beings are dialogical, I'm not just describing something that is fundamental to who we are, but also I'm trying to convey a certain, as I stated it already, a certain moral imperative, a certain sense of obligation, where we are called, where we are sort of commanded even in a way to do our best to understand others. And so here I'm coming back, right, to this key Gadamerian notion of verstehen in German, or understanding. And that's what he is really about. Now, of course, as I have already intimated in this and in previous episodes, there is always a certain limit attached to that. Because if dialogue is a moral imperative, then dialogue implies a certain willingness to listen, a certain bracketing of one's own preconceptions in order to listen to the other. Then, obviously, the inverse is also the case. Namely, that very often we do not have an interest to listen to others. Very often we are just about ourselves, right? We just want to tell our own story. We don't have patience, time, willingness, or even compassion or empathy to be open to others. So there's a deep sense of limit that is there. And in our contemporary culture, there are, again, many forces that preclude meaningful understanding. Like, right, if you do not have, just think about this, right? If you do not have the willingness to be corrected, if you do not have the patience and attentiveness to listen to the other without constantly trying to correct them, enlighten them, teach them, if you don't have that, how can dialogue happen? In a marriage, in a friendship, if you already have this sense that you've heard everything before, that there's nothing to learn from the other human being, that the other human being is not really that interested, how can conversation, how can deep dialogue take place? And therefore, I think that any sort of thinking or any specific activities, any endeavors that seek to foster dialogue among human beings is something that Gadamer would really fundamentally agree with, and is something that is a significant, important need for all of us in today's age. Now, I referenced before, and I will reference again, I don't know what the right word would be, perhaps organization, Free Intelligent Conversation, which is spearheaded by my friend Kyle Emil, and they have done an amazing job, right? And you can read about them, and I've talked about this in the past, so I will not take up space in our time now, right? But if you Google Free Intelligent Conversation and how they go about trying to foster dialogue among people on street corners, right? And how people have really a thirst to actually have meaningful dialogue. I mean, that is just fantastic, and it really goes towards what Gadamer is all about. But I think I want to bring Gadamer closer to us even more by connecting him with an article that came out on November 19 in the New York Times. The author of the article is David Brooks, and his article is titled 9 Non-Obvious Ways to Have Deeper Conversation. And he talks about in the article about the art of making connection even in a time of dislocation. And what he says there is so significant and so apropos when it comes to discussing Gadamer that I wanted to bring this up. So the first thing that he mentions, like one of the principles we should keep in mind, is approach with awe. And he references here C.S. Lewis, who once wrote that if you never meet a human and suddenly encountered one, you'd be inclined to worship this creature. Like they're no insignificant people, as C.S. Lewis puts it. And if we could approach every human being with that sense, it doesn't come without effort. It goes against perhaps our senses, right? When we see a human being and we think we know already everything about them, we have already grouped them in different groupings. We heard them talk, perhaps even nonsense in the past. So this effort, intentional effort to approach every human being as the bearer of enlightened truth, if we could have that, if we could have that energy of willpower, that would really contribute to a meaningful dialogue in a significant way. It says, this is a reference to Lady Randolph Churchill. He writes, said once that when sitting next to the statesman William Gladstone, she taught him to be the cleverest person in England. But when she sat next to Benjamin Disraeli, she thought she was the cleverest person in England. I mean, isn't that an amazing gift that we can give to other human beings? That other human beings in dialogue and in conversation with us actually think, as a result of that they are perhaps the cleverest person in the world, right? And that's a good point, right? Ask elevating question is the second thing he brings up. I mean, that's right. What we're trying to do is that we try to take this kind of foundational philosophical hermeneutics via Gadamer and apply it to dialogue and conversation. And see, this is the second point that we can take, right? Ask elevating questions, right? Some questions, might be startling, they might be unusual, but when you ask people those kind of questions, they open up. And I believe that people actually most people long for to be asked meaningful questions. Like questions like tell me about some significant mistake you've made in the last 2 years. Or what crossroads are you at, he writes here. What commitments have you made that you no longer believe in? Who do you feel most grateful to have in your life? Who would you like to become? And questions like that. Then my wife and I, we've sometimes asked those questions through some cards that we have that actually free intelligent conversation. They have those cards and you can get those cards from them. And we give those cards to people who are around the table. So instead of commenting on politics and who knows what, people have to answer, or they're invited to answer these questions. And I kid you not, the conversation that follows as a result of that is absolutely amazing. And I wonder, why are we not doing that? Why are we, why do we have this bigotry of low expectations when it comes to our guests or to people in general? So that we never ask them these kind of queries. I mean, that's often what I think about, right? Number 3, ask open-ended questions, which is kind of related to the second point. Make them authors, not witnesses. That's an interesting point that Brooks brings out, right? The important part of people's lives is not what happened to them, but how they experienced what happened to them. So the best conversations are not just about recitations of events. They involve going over and over an event, seeing it from wider perspectives, coating it with new layers of emotion, transforming it so that, say, an event that was very hard to live through is now very satisfying to remember. I mean, that is an art, right? Helping people in a gentle way, perhaps to rethink certain events, not by lecturing them, not by giving them sort of some predetermined molds into which they have to fit their experiences, by kind of dialoguing with them and helping them, enabling them to read what happened to them through a variety of perspectives. Treat attention as all or nothing. And Brooks makes the note here that of course we have a divided attention. And he notes that it's hard to pay attention, right? But in a conversation, it's best to act as if attention had an on and off switch with no dimmer. Total focus, right? And so when you can listen to someone, not just 20, 30, 50, 60%, where you zoom in and zoom out, but with full rapt attention, that is, I think, again, one of the most glorious gifts we can give to others. It's not easy. It's actually very exhausting, to be quite honest, right? But it is something that is fundamental to dialogue. So that when you're able to respond what people have said, you might even put it in better words than what they have tried to say it, right? You really, when you convey, when you summarize what they've said, for instance, they can totally recognize their own thoughts in what you're saying. I mean, that is beautiful. And often in marriages and relationships, that ability goes by the waysides. That doesn't take place anymore. If you don't listen deeply and attentively, and relationships suffer as a result of that. And so I truly believe that when we talk about loving others and giving the gift of love to others, one of the primary ways in which that gift of love can be offered to fellow human beings is to give them the gift of attentiveness. And that goes back really to what Gadamer writes about when he talks about the fusion of horizons, right? So you have your perspective, which might be alien to mine. I have my perspective. But as I listen attentively to where you're coming from and to the ideas that you have, some fusion of perspective is taking place. I'm learning about you. I am enlarging my worldview. I am correcting some of my assumptions. I am able to better step into your shoes. So this notion of dialogue resulting in a fusion of horizons is one of the most significant and well-known aspects of Gadamer's thought, which has, again, really potent practical applications. And this is how he concludes. Deeper conversations help people become explicable to each other and themselves. You can't really know yourself until you know how you express yourself and find yourself in another's eyes. Deeper conversation builds trust, the oxygen of society, exactly what we are missing right now. Humans need to be heard before they will listen. Humans need to be heard before they will listen, Amanda Ripley writes. So thanks again for listening to this episode on Gadamer and the importance of understanding dialogue, interpretation, and language. Stay safe, stay courageous, and live well until next time. Goodbye.